have the editors and chapter author from the new book, Islam and International Development, Insights for Working with Muslim Communities. And this is the launch of the book. It's a new book that just came out at the end of last year. I'm happy to say that we will be hearing from 3 speakers today. Our 3 speakers are Dr. Ajaz Ahmed Khan, who's the Senior Microfinance Advisor from CARE International and a book editor. Affan Cheema, Head of Program Quality at Islamic Relief Worldwide, also a book co-editor. And Dr. Silvia Brown, Conflict Advisor at Islamic Relief Worldwide as well, who authored one of the chapters. I will, Rima, if we can please start recording. This is going to be a recorded session. The recording is posted on our website. To all participants, if you would like to enter questions in the chat as we go along, you're very welcome. But there'll also be some time at the end for questions and answers. Rima, if you could just go to the next slide to show the session agenda. So we'll hear from Ajaz, then over to Affan and Silvia, and finally time for questions and answers. I am therefore very happy, if we go to the next slide, to pass over to Ajaz to introduce the book and start our session today. Over to you.
Thank you, Olivia. Quick update on the weather. The cold rain this morning has gradually given way to sleet and snow. Looking out the window, no chance of it changing anytime soon. So I hope that helps with any homesickness that you might have for the northwest of England. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be. Thank you, Olivia and the Joint Learning Initiative, for allowing us this opportunity to say a few words about our recently published book. I do hope you find our presentations interesting. I wanted to begin by providing a general introduction and then explain some of the main reasons why we decided to embark on this adventure. My co-editor Affan Cheema will then speak a little bit about an Islamic understanding of poverty and how this differs perhaps from more mainstream definitions. And he'll also touch upon the overarching importance of Maqasid al-Sharia, or the objectives of Islamic law. Then, as Olivia mentioned, one of the book's contributors, Dr. Silvia Brown, who co-wrote the chapter on an Islamic approach to peace building and conflict prevention, will provide some practical insights that reflect on how Islamic teachings have been incorporated and used in actual peace building projects by Islamic Relief. Now, afterwards, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have, and if you don't have time in today's webinar, or if something occurs to you afterwards, then please do by all means contact us, and we'd be more than happy to respond. So a little bit description about the book now. So altogether there are 10 chapters in the book, and they were written by a total of 12 authors. To whom I should mention we're very grateful for their time, their expertise and their insights. Now each chapter covers a distinct development topic. So for example, forced migration and refugees, gender-based violence, peace building and conflict prevention, Islamic social and spiritual capital, and as Affan will talk about in a little bit, Islamic definitions of poverty. I guess the result is quite an ambitious book because it covers such a wide range of topics. Now, when it came to selecting topics, what we thought initially was that, firstly, we try and select things that were of most interest and relevance to current development debates. And secondly, those that have generally not been well analysed. So, for example, I have a teeny weeny bit of knowledge in Islamic microfinance, but comparatively speaking, we felt this has been well covered elsewhere. So it's not really analysed in any real depth in this book, although I do refer to one notable example, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Broadly speaking, the approach we adopt in each chapter is similar. So we examine relevant Islamic teachings on the subject, and then we look at how these have been used or indeed could be used to understand and inform discussions on key issues and structure and implement development projects. In effect, and I think one of the reviewers put it quite succinctly, it's theological insights combined with practical examples. Now, of course, this can be very, very challenging. Interpreting Islamic teachings is not always straightforward. There's not always agreement. And of course, and importantly, I should mention, none of us are specialist Islamic scholars. Nevertheless, I think as a primary source of reference, we looked at the Quran as much as possible to support arguments. And we generally looked at more than one English translation to get an idea of the true intended meaning of words. Because it doesn't always translate easily from the Arabic. We also reference the Sunnah, or the traditions and the practices of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and we restricted ourselves to a hadith or sayings of the Prophet that have been graded as strong. Who is the book aimed at? Well, first and foremost, it's other development professionals, that is, our peers in the aid and development sector, as well as more broadly researchers and academics in the area of faith and development. Okay, now let me move a little bit on to say a little bit about some of the reasons for compiling the book. My personal interest in the area of faith and development actually goes back to some 30 years ago, to when I first began working as a humble agricultural economist in Latin America a long time ago. Partly motivated as I was at the time by a desire to be close to the spiritual home of the beautiful game. In Central and South America, I had the opportunity to observe the influence of Catholic and indigenous beliefs and teachings on the lives and the practices of the people I was working with. By and large, they were peasant farmers. It was also the first time that I had the opportunity firsthand to observe the impact of liberation theology, which was particularly prominent at the time. The influence of faith generally, I mean, even though I approached development as a technical specialist, as I said, as an agricultural economist. So the influence of faith was also apparent when I first started working with Muslim majority communities many years later. And I should stress that like myself, all the contributors who wrote the individual chapters are practitioners, and they've worked in the field of humanitarian aid and development for many years. I suppose between us, we probably have many decades of field experience, and the individual chapters that we've put together are in effect a culmination of our own experiences that gathered over that time. And a lot of the practical examples that we refer to are often projects that we've been directly involved with and observed on the ground. Now, I guess the key argument in this book, and perhaps it's worth emphasizing, is that in our experiences, and I've certainly noticed this wherever I've worked in the world, faith is central, absolutely central to the lives of many of the people living in poverty. It's the lens through which they view the world, and it's a way for them to make sense of life's experiences. Despite this importance, it's generally been marginalized, downplayed, or ignored altogether by a lot in the international development sector. And I say this as someone who for most of my working life, I've worked in non-faith-based organizations. It has changed a little bit over the years, but not a great deal. And I'd even go as far as to suggest that when it comes to Muslim communities, faith is even sometimes perceived to have a negative influence. And our view, in contrast, and what we consistently argue throughout the book, is that a faith inclusive approach is key to understanding the world from the perspective of those we are seeking to support. Which of course is good, it's right, it's proper in itself. But secondly, it's also key to promoting better development outcomes. So both of these arguments should be of interest to all of us involved in aid and development, regardless of whom we work for and regardless of whether we adhere to a particular religious faith or indeed none at all. The main motivation for writing the book was to interpret and analyze how Islamic teachings might be used to address pressing development challenges. It's not something that's been looked at in any great detail, although, to be fair, in recent years, organizations such as Islamic Relief have taken a lead and have undertaken some excellent research in this regard, and they've produced a number of policy positions on a range of issues, and certainly on occasions they've adopted a very prominent advocacy position. And of course, there's some very isolated but successful examples of Islamic teachings being used in practical development projects, and we've highlighted some of these in the book. However, overall, practical applications are still relatively few, and using Islamic teachings as a framework to develop and implement projects or to engage with people, I mean, I'd say it remains a vastly underutilized resource. Now, let me just discuss this point in a little bit more detail. So, as most people are aware, the importance of charitable giving in Islam is clear, it's well established, and it's well known that zakat, or obligatory alms or charity, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. In fact, Professor Habib Ahmed, in one of the chapters in the book, offers some very innovative analysis and calculations on the potential of Islamic social finance, so essentially zakat and waqf, for generating financial resources that could be used for poverty alleviation and development. However, while a lot of attention is focused on emphasizing charitable obligations, from a personal perspective, I've always been interested in addressing the very practical question: how should the poor be helped? How does Islam advocate helping the poor? Not particular categories or where we access the finance, but how should we structure development programs? So this is something that I've explored in one of the chapters, and my analysis of Islamic teachings is that the hadith or sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are particularly clear on this point, and they encourage helping poor people to become financially self-sufficient and self-reliant. And at the same time, they're clear in discouraging dependency on charity and economic reliance on others. So that's quite clear from Islamic teachings. Despite this, so my research on sort of the 7 largest Muslim faith-based organizations in the United Kingdom, for example, who've got a combined budget of several $100 million, a lot of which comes from faith-based giving. So that sort of analysis reveals that the programs that come closest to this self-sufficient, self-reliance approach of promoting, in effect, sustainable livelihoods, they actually only comprise a small fraction of their overall program expenditure. So, in effect, and by and large, Muslim faith-based organizations, a lot of them are humanitarian relief agencies, not longer-term development institutions. And along the same lines, there's a few verses in the Quran which encourage us to be the voice of the poor and the marginalized, in effect, advocates on a range of pressing development issues, and such as climate change, for example. Yet again, and if we look at the same organizations and their latest audited accounts, it's only Islamic Relief that dedicates any of its expenditure on advocacy. And even then, it's just a very tiny fraction of a little bit more than 1%. None of the other Muslim faith-based organizations report any expenditure on advocacy, which is kind of surprising. So in effect, an Islamic approach to development would point in a certain program direction, but the reality is that a lot of program activities undertaken by the Muslim faith-based organizations in the UK are in a different directions, and we discussed a lot of the reasons for this, why it might be the case in the book. Now, turning our attention a little bit further afield, I guess one of the most successful examples of incorporating Islamic teachings into development programs, and probably that coincides quite closely with Islamic teachings, and which we look at very briefly in the book, is Ahuat Islamic Microfinance from Pakistan. So Ahuat is an organization that provides Qard Hasan, or interest-free benevolent loans to the poor. And Qard Hasan loans are explicitly encouraged in several verses of the Quran. Now, although it's branched out and Ahuat started as a microfinance organization around 20 years ago, and in that regard, it's become hugely successful with over 1 million active clients and an outstanding portfolio, over $100 million in loans. I mean, incidentally, the cover of the book, it shows an Ahuat loan ceremony taking place in the Badshai Masjid in Lahore with 20,000 people gathered. But in part, I think Ahuat's success is due clearly to the dedication and the commitment of its many thousands of staff. And this in itself is not entirely surprising. I think it's probably been a feature of all the faith-based organizations I've ever come across in the last 30 years. And I think a remarkable feature of Ahuat's work is also, it's not the fact that essentially unsecured loans are so diligently repaid. I think repayment stands at over 99% even during the coronavirus pandemic, or even that it's turned kind of conventional economic theory on its head and become financially self-sustainable. But rather, I think the most remarkable feature of their work is that it has such unwavering support, goodwill, receptiveness from the local communities comprised of people of all faiths that it worked with. So I've been fortunate to observe their operations at quite close quarters over the last 7 or 8 years. And it's remarkable to see how the people that it works with so enthusiastically become, in turn, donors, supporters, and advocates of its development approach, and not simply clients or passive beneficiaries. And I think they do this because they quite clearly believe and they identify with Ahuat's faith-based approach, and the way they've incorporated Islamic teachings into practical programs. Interestingly, Ahuat's faith-based approach has even enabled it to work and indeed prosper in the sensitive, federally administrative tribal areas which border Pakistan. Fatah, which I think now is part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, is a region where other development organizations find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to operate, and indeed many of them are deemed unwelcome. So a very impressive institution in the way Ahuat's incorporated faith into its work. Now, very briefly, let me discuss one more case, and I'll make reference to a chapter that I helped write in the book that explores Islamic teachings regarding environmental sustainability. Now, these sort of teachings stress our responsibility to provide stewardship of the earth's resources, a teaching that's not unique to Islam. It's of course shared with other faiths. And however, despite the fact that more than 10% of the Quran is comprised of green verses, which, amongst other things, make clear that the creation of the heavens and the earth is far greater than the creation of mankind, and urge us to maintain or keep the environmental balance. Despite these clear teachings and the prominence that it's given in Islamic teachings, there's been relatively few faith-based initiatives that use Islamic environmental teachings as a mechanism both to structure development interventions and to engage with people. Now, finally, let me to finish off. Let me say something on another motivation for writing the book. In recent times, development and humanitarian agencies, and probably, to be honest, most of society in general, have been re-examining issues of identity, legitimacy, and diversity. And our sincere hope is that this book, in some small way, helps to stimulate the discussion about the importance of faith in development strategies, particularly when engaging with Muslim communities, institutions, and faith leaders. And particularly, we hope that it encourages a wider range of Muslim development professionals and faith-based agencies to articulate their perspectives and importantly, have their voices heard. That's it. Thank you for listening. I'll pass over to my co-editor now, Affan Cheema, to speak a little bit about Islamic definitions of poverty and the importance of Maqasid al-Sharia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajaz. Olivia, can I get my screen up? I think I need access. Right, brilliant, got it. Let me share the screen. If somebody can confirm they can see that.
Not yet. Rima, you might have to stop sharing. Oh, now we could, yes, it's coming through. There it is. We've got it. Thanks, Affan.
Brilliant. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Ajaz. And I think I also am going to start with a thank you to all the contributors. And I think that includes the authors to each chapter, Practical Action Publishing, JLI for the opportunity for this launch, and those of you who have tuned into this. And of course, I got to include those of you who bought the book. And the reason I start off with that is it's important that this discussion starts and really moves on. And I want to give you a little bit, again, of a personal perspective on what motivated me to put the effort into this project. And I certainly don't see the book as the end of that project. I'd state two core factors. And Ajaz, this might be a bit of a revelation. The first is I've now been working in the aid sector for 25 years. Now, I suppose in some way it's sad that the silver anniversary has resulted in this book. During that period, traveled in Asia, Africa, Middle East, worked with communities rooted in faith, and have noted how the nature of the discourse must be rooted in what drives such communities. I've sat with Muslim communities and have been discussing best practice using the conventional sector language that I've been trained in. And at times I've had glazed looks looking back at me. But when I've said Islam says something, or the Quran says something else, or the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said X or did X, I actually see heads rise, I see inquisitive looks. And that's across, the aspects of age, gender, ability. That's not to necessarily say Islam is saying anything different, but to illustrate the power of working with tools that are part of the community or drive that community, i.e. their faith. In some ways, when we come to 2021, and I think it's going to be a year where the localization debate keeps moving, I find that for some reason, the element of faith and its importance in the localization debate is often forgotten, especially in London, New York, and Brussels. The second factor was my own questions around an appropriate Islamic framework, which could help the sector and thinkers bridge that gap. Now, Ajaz asked me to talk about Islam and models of poverty. Let me get a couple of things out of the way before I really get into this. I'm not going to tackle the question of does Islam make war on poverty? The undoubted answer to that is that it does. There are numerous passages in the Quran, which is the primary source, which connects worship to charity and helping others. Righteous are those that give. And Benthal calls this financial worship. The Quran states that those who end up in hell are those who did not feed the poor. And whoever saves one's life, it's as though they have saved all of humanity. Now, critical to this conversation, and Ajaz has just touched upon it, is zakat, a wealth tax which every Muslim engages with. Now, over the last decade, as you know, the global goals and the agenda for humanity played out, I started seeing the concept of zakat coming out much more in mainstream conversation. But from where I'm sat, I must say that sadly, I think, just as with many Muslim charities, the UN, multilaterals, appear to have been motivated by the level of funding that can come through this tool, which again, admittedly is eye-watering when you talk about figures of $200 billion to maybe $1 trillion a year. Although it's undoubtedly important, I do feel it's a bit of a red herring when looking at a broader Islamic approach to poverty eradication. One of the authors I quoted in the chapter that I led on Neen House concludes that although zakat is acknowledged as a centrally important religious category, Islamic discourse has for centuries hinged on it without discussing it in a substantive manner outside the realm of Islamic jurisprudence. This is primarily due to what we call social sciences being dominated by Islamic jurists. So where does that leave my own questioning around Islam's approaches to poverty? Now, as Ajaz said, there were a number of chapters in this book, and as the chapters started to come to fruition, one thing kept on coming up in numerous chapters, and that was the concept of maqasid al-sharia, which can be translated as objectives, goals, or purpose, intent of divine law. And I certainly believe it lays a foundation to understand what Islam's approach to poverty is, but if it's understood, on also how to engage with Muslim communities and faith leaders. If I go down to my next slide, you see the broad diagram around Maqasid al-Sharia, and I'll focus on the different elements here. But let me first talk about the background to it. As Muslim scholars systematized Islamic law, a tool called Maqasid al-Sharia started coming together. It worked with another doctrine called maslaha, which means public benefit. In the 12th century, it started becoming a bit more structured, and a scholar called Abu Hamid al-Ghazali developed the concept. He argued that public benefit, i.e. maslaha, drove God's general purpose behind divine law, i.e. the maqasid. And he set out the 5 principles that you see on the screen, which ensured human dignity. They ensured an element of justice, freedom, equality, within moral and ethical guidelines. Now, amongst scholars, there's general agreement around these 5, i.e. faith, life, intellect, posterity, and wealth. Later in the 14th century, another scholar built on this slightly. Al-Shatibi introduced a couple of principles that anything that works towards this intent should be supported, and anything that works against this intent should be blocked. Now, what you've got developing here is a focus on well-being, and in many ways, the do no harm principles that we talk about a lot in the sector today. It some ways codified Islamic ethics. Now, a number of the chapters in the book utilize this framework, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of the areas that you see on the screen in front of you. If we look at life, this is about focusing on human life. That can be food, shelter, health, so humanitarian as well as development. But more practically, refugees, conflict, hunger, freedom from oppression, gender-based violence. We could move to intellect, which encourages, and I don't want to narrow that down to education in its traditional way. It's knowledge generation, whether it's from a faith perspective or from a secular perspective, which encourages freedom of thought, but also encourages an understanding of different societies. And that in itself is a key player to avoiding conflict. And in that, there is no gender differentiation. If we look at posterity, future generations, meaning an obvious one there is climate change. But we can also talk about stable families, stable households, because that stable relationships, that helps in terms of child protection, domestic violence, eating good food, fair trade, all plays into that. Wealth is an obvious one, as it's critical to the development of any society, but Islam sees it as a means to an end, not an end in itself. And it very clearly has limitations in terms of hoarding, oppression. It talks about the rights of others, community spirit and benefit. How do you use the resources to benefit society as a whole? Now that's 4 of them, and I've not talked about faith, the one that's at the top, and that's one I want to delve into a little bit more. And again, you can get a lot more detail as you go through the book. You'll note faith appears at the top, and that's intentional. If one looks at a lot of the conventional models of development or poverty eradication, they moved from the principal measurement of, if you get more than $1 a day, you're kind of breaking out of poverty, to the human development indexes, and then certain more holistic well-being approaches that have been adopted by the UN. The one aspect that tends to be overlooked in conventional models is the potential of spiritual capital, a significant driver of faith-rooted community actions and, in fact, their resilience. While doing the reading around this, the Islamic development, it was interesting for me to read the Islamic Development Bank in 2007 stated that poverty notions of self-sufficiency and human dignity incorporate both material and spiritual aspects. And that was back in 2007. And from all the research that I've done, there's little evidence that this debate has moved forward in the international sphere. Spiritual capital is expanded by extensively by one of the authors, Abdallah Fitzgibbon, on how it links to all of the other values here, and in fact strengthens the drive towards an ethics-based community and develops a social contract with social obligations. So for us, when we look at these 5 values, we feel these give us the basic foundations to move forward in terms of poverty eradication. It should be noted, though, that this approach is very much an orthodox Sunni perspective, and we must recognize that there are other approaches within Islam. The book overall highlights how Maqasid al-Sharia is distinct to much of the current thinking. It acknowledges the key aspects of material needs and human rights, but in addition, Maqasid proposes that spiritual needs have to also be taken care of. They can create a multiplier effect on all other forms of poverty, as well as develop resilience and a community spirit. The focus on material needs, human rights, and spiritual needs implies that poverty can be defined as an absence of basic needs, human rights, and spiritual support. Now, there is a need to further explore and develop the Maqasid framework via scholarship and practitioners, and I hope this book kicks that off. But utilizing this approach within Muslim communities, not to replace, but to add to the current poverty discourse, we feel will result in an appropriate basis for communication, as well as arguably improved poverty eradication results. I'll end there, and I hope that gives some food for thought, and I will hand over to Dr. Silvia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Affan. Let me just see if I can share my slides as well now. Can you just let me know if you can see my slides?
Yes, we can see them now.
Great, thanks very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Silvia Brown, and I'm a conflict advisor at Islamic Relief. But my chapter on Islam and peace building was also written with Haroon Kash, who's also on this call. So let me just say now that if you want to ask a theological question, direct that one to Haroon. My contribution is much more from the sort of practical implementation of peace building side of things. And in particular, working on a peace building program in 4 countries. And I think 1 or 2 of them formed the examples that are presented in our chapter of the book. But if I can then just start with, this slide on Islam and peace building, what did we start with here? I think when I've read the book, a lot of the chapters talk about how Islamic teachings form a moral code for Muslims, and that's helpful for poverty reduction, for gender equality, for achieving environmental protection. But I would say the same really about conflict management. Islamic teachings really are so influential in people's lives, especially in places where we work, where formal conflict management systems are very, very weak. Now, we know from a lot of the literature on conflict and violence that faith can be a mobilizing frame for violence. And we've seen that in Afghanistan, in Syria, and Yemen. But I would say that can equally be true for peace. Faith is a mobilizing framework for peace as well. And the framework that I suppose we have really drawn on for this chapter comes from the publication there called Understanding an Islamic Framework for Peace Building, which was commissioned for Islamic Relief, but is published by scholars, academics who are external to the organisation. And the chapter that we wrote really presents a summary of the 8 key principles from Islam that form the basis of our own approach to peace building. Things like, for example, the pursuit of justice, compassion and mercy, pardoning and forgiveness, patience, love, respect for pluralism and diversity. The principle that, as well, that humans are good at heart and we can understand people's violent actions through reason and through analysis. The other thing, I suppose, that won't be new to this audience, is that faith teachings and faith leaders can have great influence for good and for bad. But of course, you have to be really careful about who you choose to work with, because not everything about faith leaders can be necessarily very positive. Just as not everything about culture and tradition are that positive. Which brings me on to the final point, that traditional religious and cultural customs of community reconciliation, they might be very deeply embedded in societies, and they might be very valuable resources to draw on, though not necessarily, but they might need some reform. We also produced a video for Geneva Peace Week called The Art of Peace, which is the other picture at the bottom of the screen there, which you might like to have a look at on YouTube. It's produced with Diakonia and with Imam Ali Public Students Relief Society from Iran. And it's a lovely video that sort of looks at how you use faith to help community reconciliation and trust building and peace building. This is a very sort of practical chapter. We don't try and sort of say, this is the Islamic approach to peace building. There is no agreed upon Islamic approach, but this is our interpretation of how we've interpreted those principles and put them into practice. Because we feel like the understanding of peace within Islam is very aligned with the idea of positive peace, we've interpreted it to mean a holistic approach to peace building, looking at the structures of societies, trying to support processes that reform justice systems to be more accessible, more inclusive, looking at how conflict is managed and all the structures around conflict and dispute management. We have focused very much on it, looking at inclusivity of people in local conflict management systems, respect for diversity and targeting of the most marginalized communities, which could be sort of minority tribal groups, it could be indigenous people, depends on the situation. We've had quite a focus on transforming relationships and rehumanizing others in the work that we've done. and lots of support for mediation and reconciliation. In the work that we've been doing in practice, that we've also sort of looked at specific activities to combat specific issues, which might be, for example, misinformation on social media that drives violence, or poor faith literacy on peace, technical training to local officials on dispute resolution, mediation training. It could even be something like water source reconstruction in Pakistan's case, actually in the tribal areas. The destruction of water sources and the lack of water to downstream communities was a source of conflict between tribes. So rebuilding the water sources and doing a little bit of work on dispute management around water was itself a peace building activity in that area. And we've also provided support to traditional and new religious and cultural conflict resolution and reconciliation practices. What else? So what have we learned? There's a few things that we've learned through our sort of experience over the last few years, and from projects older than that as well. Where can a Muslim FBO, faith-based organisation, act? Well, first of all, I guess the point is where we have trust, relationships and credibility. And for our own organisations, a case, that meant at the local level, the community-based level, that's where the organisation has the relationships and the trust and the credibility. So that's where we work. And because we have those relationships and that trust in place, we can play a really powerful convening role in bringing together local government, customary leaders, potentially faith leaders, although not necessarily, women's leaders, youth leaders, any other sort of group leaders in those communities, to jointly assess problems that are driving violence in the area or driving tensions. And because we have a real credibility, because we are a Muslim faith-based organisation in Muslim communities, that there's so much trust invested in us that we are able to act as a kind of trusted third party to mediation and dispute resolution processes. We sometimes act as a witness, signing peace agreements, but just bringing people together in that convening role, I think, is a really, really valuable role, and one that secular organisations really would struggle with. Another thing that we can do really quite well is to amplify local voices that wouldn't necessarily be heard very well. And that has meant some local faith actors in some of the places that we've been working in. We've found some really wonderful madrasa teachers and local imams who have incredible messages and can talk really well, but they didn't really have much of a platform before. So they only had their community in the school or in their mosque, but we've put them on local radio, and their voices and messages have reached a far greater audience, and that's been very powerful. Of course, there's issues with who you choose. You've got to be really careful about who you choose, which voices you choose to amplify. We've also done a lot of work with customary conflict resolution mechanisms and capacity building of local peace builders, just providing sometimes a technical training on dispute resolution and mediation itself has been really powerful, because people haven't always had any opportunity to attend that kind of training before. Setting up conflict early warning systems has been something that's been really useful, that we've got involved in as well. In Kenya, for example, the people use WhatsApp as a conflict early warning system. It's been really good at sort of nipping issues in the bud before they can escalate into a cycle of revenge and reprisals. And as a sort of external but very trusted organisation, we've found that we can advocate really quite successfully for greater inclusion in community structures, which have usually been dominated by older men. So it's been really helpful for us to be able to advocate for inclusion of women and younger voices as well, younger people. What have we found as being kind of off limits, I suppose, for the work that we do? So engagement with armed groups, we've got to recognise the environment that we're in at the moment. A lot of the armed groups in a lot of countries that we work in have a kind of Islamist feel to them. We've got to be really, really careful about any engagement. So unless there's a peace framework in place for any engagement, which there is, for example, in the Philippines, we can engage with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front because they're part of a peace agreement. Otherwise, we can't engage with any group, and that means in the Philippines, for example, that the Bangsamoro Islamic freedom fighters can't attend any of our trainings or economic opportunities for young people or demobilized fighters because of their affiliation with an organization that's not part of a peace agreement. So we've got to be really careful about what's off limits there. Of course, this is politicized peace dividend project, and this is probably something that any NGO would want to avoid, not just faith-based organizations. High-level conflict resolution processes. I mean, it's not off limits necessarily to everyone. It's just because of the kind of the situation of the world at the moment, being a Muslim faith-based organization is quite challenging, and I can't see how a Muslim organization would get involved in those high-level conflict resolution processes at the moment. Peacekeeping, of course, that's not our role. Deciding on disputes and how to resolve them as well, I think, is really off limits because an NGO is supposed to be independent, isn't it? It's not supposed to make those kinds of decisions. So we support bringing communities together, but we don't decide on disputes. That's up to them. We also don't get involved really in security sector reform or formal types of justice sector reform. Although in the work that we've done, we have had security agents come to attend sort of workshops, trainings on like international humanitarian law. During hot times, for me, this means that when the conflict's still very, very hot and there isn't stability, there isn't a political settlement in place, is it possible for a Muslim faith-based organization to intervene in terms of like peace building? And my sense is no, probably not. It's just practically not possible, and the politics are too difficult and too murky at that sort of time. But I'm happy to be challenged on that. And then my sort of final slide is another one about, I suppose, what have we learned from the peace building work that we've done in Muslim communities from our own experience. Very much to start with the language and worldview of the communities that we work with. There's the idea of the liberal peace is so alien and highly unrealistic in the communities that we work with that it's completely pointless to go in with that as your sort of starting point or objective. And we need to understand really the long history of conflict in those areas, which is itself really, really tricky. In terms of the language, one of the small learning points for us has been, don't talk about peace building, don't mention the word peace building, don't mention the word conflict, because they're such loaded terms. You have to find other ways with the community to talk about the issues, the divisions, the tensions in their communities. Political awareness and context sensitivity, we have to be so very careful because of the climate of the times. Not just to steer clear of any engagement with Islamist armed groups, but there's a real sensitivity of being a Muslim organization and talking about peace in the current climate, because loads of other organizations have come in and talked about peace with me, often meaning something actually quite the opposite. So when communities can be very skeptical of Muslim faith-based organizations, any external actor coming in and talking about peace, and rightly so. So we have to be very careful about building relationships and explaining what we mean. We also have to do exactly that with local government, security forces, national government, because all of them are very, very nervous of a Muslim organization talking about peace. And just also, security forces rotate every year. So every year we have to go through the same conversations again and again with local security. What else? What do communities prioritize most? What's their vision of peace? That, this is really, really important. It's just like we can't go in with the liberal peace idea. We can't go in with any external idea about what we think you should do to build peace in this area? We have to ask communities themselves, what do you prioritize? What is your vision? What does peace look like for you? And of course, for different people in the community, it might mean very different things. Often people might prioritize stability and a political settlement first, often before kind of the access to development issues. But then what women will prioritize will be different from what young people and older people prioritize. And we have to be mindful of that and try and negotiate with communities together to support the building of stability and their vision of peace. Working with Muslim faith leaders, we found it has been effective in some places, but not in others. And it's not in places where they are locally not very legitimate, or they're quite politicized, or they're perceived to be biased, which they certainly are in some places. But where they do have moral authority and where they are perceived to be very helpful, then yes, working with Muslim faith leaders has been really, really effective, and we would like to do more of it, actually. The final sort of really strong point I think that we've found from our own experience is that a Western Muslim faith-based organisation really acts as a kind of bridge of ideas between Muslim communities in non-Western places and international norms of human rights. And Muslim communities, especially in places like Pakistan, are very, very fearful of the Western hegemony, Western human rights. You come in and talk about women's equality, that's fine if you're in Britain, but it's not fine for us. It really is an attack on our culture. That's the sort of feeling. But if a Muslim faith-based organisation talks about these issues and puts it in a language that can resonate better with Muslim communities, then actually we can find that there much greater acceptance for those ideas. We're able to move the conversation on in communities towards greater gender equality, towards greater inclusion, acceptance of diversity, and those kinds of things that help to build more peaceful relations within communities. So that's the end of sort of my presentation. I'd love to hear what you all think of the book, if you had a chance to read it. Welcome any questions that you might have. I'm not sure I'd necessarily be able to answer them all, but you never know. I'd love to have a discussion with you anyway.
Thanks, Sylvia, and thanks to all of you. And I see that we also even have some of the other chapter on the call too, so we have lots of people that can answer questions. I invite now, we've got a few minutes and we can even go a few minutes over the hour for those of you who can stay to ask questions. I invite you to ask your questions in the chat or raise your hand and I'll call on you to unmute and ask a question. So we're open for any questions to any questions or comments to any of the presenters and chapter authors. I'm seeing one raised hand, but I can't see who it's connected to, I'm afraid. So if you can unmute and ask your question.
Hello, everyone. My name is Santiago. And I would like to ask you a question. I think, well, thank you for this great introduction to the book. It is really interesting indeed. Well, my question basically is that I do understand that the focus here is clearly Islamic teaching in developing programs, but based on your experience with working with people of other faiths, I wonder if there is a scope for ecumenical approaches in development strategies, because I'm thinking this question in terms of societies that are heterogeneous, religiously heterogeneous, such as India. You know, in India you have one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, but at the same time, it is a minority. And I wonder if there is a chance for an ecumenical approach in such cases when we talk about development, when we talk about peace building. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I guess you might say interfaith even approaches, and in environments where maybe the Muslim community is the religious minority. Who wants to take that big question?
Maybe I could make an attempt to answer that question. Gracias, Santiago. Thank you for the easy question. I think rather than a specific belief, I think often it's the fact that, because a lot of the beliefs are shared, I think often it's the recognition that faith has been recognized. That's the key issue. I think going back to the example that I mentioned in my presentation, I mean, Ahuwat in Pakistan is so successful, and it works with all communities. I think all the faiths have bought into its approach to the way that it does the work. It's not limited to just Muslims, and obviously if there can be interfaith initiatives, I think that always sort of works better in issues where there's multi-faiths. I'm not sure whether, Affan, you might have anything to add, or maybe one of the other people who contributed to the book might be able to sort of.
Yeah, I see Atala is unmuted as well.
Yeah, I think he would be the best person to let
Yeah,
speak.
no, it's a really good question. And I think it's particularly, ecumenical approaches are particularly relevant in relation to peace building, but possibly other areas such as microfinance, and the impact of ecumenical approaches to building social capital and social contacts across social divides. So what I think is fairly clear now from a range of experiences that if one works with a mixed community on the basis that you would build understanding of each other's faith and how each other's faith then relates to their faith, that then helps each faith community humanize the other and build trust and understanding and relations. And there's this sort of well-known social contact theory, which particularly sort of emerged out of research. I know in Northern Ireland, where communities had built over generations of division and alienation, derogatory attitudes to each other, but actually when social contacts were built, you know, that started to break down as they humanize things. I think that goes even further when you then start to understand each other's faith and you say, oh gosh, that's so similar to mine. Oh, that's really good. Okay, now I can. So and in relation to sort of microfinance, Ajaz will know this because we worked together in Bosnia, and you know, providing, for instance, Islamic microfinance to non-Muslim communities had a really fantastic reaction in relation to that. But it requires then an approach on both sides. And I'm currently involved in a peace building project that actually does exactly that. So each faith community then works on their own intra-faith understanding of theology and otherness or how pluralism, and then builds interfaith relations and goals around faith communities working together on things. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Atala. I should have said Atala Fitzgibbon, who's one of the chapter authors and also advisor at Islamic Relief Worldwide. So we have a question from Amjad Salim in the chat that I'll just read out. So to the speakers, what are the challenges you see around the discourse on Islam and development? And then potentially linked to that, where do we move from here? And what are your aspirations?
I can maybe take that one. Thank you very much, Amjad. I think when you look at the challenges around it, I think you can. There's one internal, and I think I would say one internal, one external, that I see straight away. There's an internal one whereby within Muslim thought and Islamic thought, as I pointed out, the framework that we had outlined, the Maqasid, is very much a Sunni Orthodox framework. But even within that, there are very much diverse views. And for me, when going through the reading and the research, it was interesting to try and understand why has Maqasid al-Sharia in some ways been relegated within Muslim thinking, and more specific rulings or tools have been given more prominence. And that's, to be honest, that's still a question in my mind. And I think that is something that needs to be explored, and that's an internal challenge. And it does come from the diversity within Islam and different views. I think the external one doesn't need too much expansion. And I think right now we're in an era where far too often, if you bring the term of Islam into any kind of conversations, and we want them in the conversations. I mean, you go on to say, where do we move from here? We want them in the conversations in Brussels, London, Jeddah, Islam. We want them in all of these conversations, but there can be a nervousness around, okay, are they looking to proselytize? Or it can get caught up in the bigger political discussions around Islam. So, meaning that those are kind of the two. One, there is an internal challenge around this, and this book, we hope, triggers part of that debate, but there's also an external challenge.
Thanks, Affan. We have one question. Probably I'd say now I'll ask this as the final question, unless anyone has any burning other questions. And I wonder maybe if Ajaz or Affan, you wouldn't mind sharing a contact email that people could follow up with you in the chat if they have thoughts after this. But anyway, the final question from Akand: how can the Western Islamic FBOs further engage local communities and support development of local Islamic FBOs that can be sustainable? So this is a nice localization question, I think. And then secondly, how do you balance between this international language, for example, liberal peace, and local languages and ways of expressing? Okay, so who wants to take maybe the first question around this localization, support to local Muslim FBOs?
I think I might let somebody who works for a Western Islamic faith-based organization maybe answer that. I might, if you may, just go back to one of the points that Affan made in the previous response. I think the reality is, and we have to recognize this, and as I mentioned, I spent most of my working life over the last 30 years or so working for secular Western organizations. I think this is a point Affan made a long time ago to me. And the reality is, they have real difficulties engaging with faith. I think that is the reality, and we need to recognize. But as I've said, it's not necessarily that we are asking people to be religious. It's just that recognizing the lives of the people that we're wishing to support. Faith is key to them. So it's all about promoting good development and trying to understand from the perspective of the people that we're trying to help. I think that's key, and I think colleagues in a lot of the secular aid agencies, humanitarian organizations around the world still have real difficulties in understanding that.
I can certainly pick up the question around how can Western Islamic faith-based organizations further engage with local communities and support development of local Islamic FBOs. I think there's a challenge in the way a number of the Western Islamic FBOs operate. And there's a starting point, which is now starting to potentially shift with the localization debate, it's very much built on the principle of, right, we will go and implement ourselves. So when you go, you implement programs yourself, the space to harness, develop local Islamic FBOs, that there's little space for that. However, as I said, that is starting to change, and I know a number of the Islamic FBO that I'm part of, but also a number of the ones that I'm engaged with, are certainly trying to tackle this question of, okay, how do why should we as Western Islamic FBOs make the assumption, again, that we know what's best for what's happening locally? And there is a lot of reflection going on there. There is also, though, a secondary angle to this. And you see this when you do engage in the aid architectures in country. Those aid architectures are very much built by the UN or the national setups. And I can certainly talk from my own experience that when I've moved in within those circles, there's at times been an absence of local Islamic FBOs. You find it a lot stronger at maybe an organic local level, but developed into a local NGO that tends to have access to these circles and the power structures. That's been rare, and I think we do, and I think this is where the sustainability and the institutionalization of some of these Islamic FBOs would be really helpful to the sector. And I think the last thing I'm going to make, just again on the journey that Islamic FBOs, one of the challenges they will have and they will have to overcome is the kind of accusation of, okay, you're a Muslim or an Islamic FBO and all you want to fund is local Islamic FBOs. And I think that as well is something that you come across, and it's one we've got to overcome. Now, of course, there are many people on this call who would also have a perspective around that. Back to you, Olivia.
Thank you, Affan. There's a lot to discuss. I'm just aware that we're over the time, so I don't want to run too long into the rest of people's days. But thank you very much to everyone for your participation, for your questions and comments in the chat. This, as a reminder, we have been recording this and it will be posted online, so you will be able to share this recording. And of course, the book is available to purchase now. So we have a regular schedule of calls. The next call we have is on the 11th of February. If you'd like to hear more about our calls and hear more from the presentations we have every month on a different topic related to religion and development, we'd encourage you to look at our website and sign up and hear more about that. But otherwise, thank you very much to Ajaz, Affan and Silvia. We're very appreciative of their time, and it's been great to be able to launch the book in this webinar today. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Olivia. It's been really nice to join the group today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.